If you had the option to choose of taking $1 million or $50,000 a year for the rest of your life, what would you do? And some of you may think this is a trick question, I'm not sure. And so I'm going to break down the math of what this would look like and then help you decide of, hey, how valuable is this pension? Should I be looking to take a lump sum? And just to give you an idea of also the worth of a pension. So obviously a ton of people who watch these videos have pensions, have $1 million or more. And so we're going to talk about the differences of the value of a pension and the value of having that net worth too. And the good thing for you is if you have both, well, then you're in what we call the 2% club, where less than 10% of people have $1 million or more, and less than 20% of people have a pension. Combine those two percentages, you're left with 2%, and that's you in this unique crowd. So that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode of Joe Knows Retirement.
Joe knows taxes.
Joe knows the market.
Joe knows Social Security.
Joe knows income planning.
Joe knows pickleball? No.
This is Joe Knows Retirement.
My name is Joe Schmitz. I'm the CEO and founder of Peak Retirement Planning, where we help those who we call Midwestern millionaires, hardworking people, people who are frugal, people who have done all the right things all of these years. And I actually wrote a book about this concept called The Midwestern Millionaire. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. So let's break this down then of $1 million versus $50,000 a year. So obviously $50,000 a year, a lot of it's going to depend on what's your age, right? If you're 75 and you are elected this option, then you're probably more likely going to want to take the $1 million. But if you are 55 or 60, like a lot of the people we see who retire early, well, maybe you can put more of a justification for the $50,000 a year. So let's break down the math here and think, how much would we need? How many payouts would we need of $50,000 a year to make up for that $1 million? And obviously the answer is 20 years, right? If we get $50,000 a year for 20 years, then we're going to be in a great place, right? We're going to be at that $1 million mark. But what happens if you pass away after 5 years? Well, you're not going to get that full payout, and that's where the $1 million can come into play, right? The other consideration here is, with this $50,000 a year, is there a cost of living adjustment associated with it? Because if there's a cost of living adjustment associated with it, and that's a generous amount, that's where it could start to make more sense to take the pension payout. Because if you live 30 years, you're well over that $1 million, but also you're getting increases every single year for the rest of your life as well. And so that's going to be a consideration there for you. So a lot of people, though, they value the $1 million for a couple reasons. And one reason is if you were to take the 4% rule, the 4% rule says that you can take out $40,000 of that $1 million, 4%, each year for the rest of your life, and you won't have to worry about running out of money. And that calculation, it also is going to adjust for inflation, so you're going to be able to take out more than $40,000 each year for the rest of your life, and it should last you 30 years. Now, there's a lot of people that will argue the 4% rule and say that it does not work, and I could agree with that, especially a few years ago when interest rates were really low. Right now, interest rates are a bit higher. You can get a guaranteed 4 or 5% return in the marketplace without having to take any risk in money markets and CDs and things like that. And so it may be more realistic to reach that assumption of 30 years based on the assumptions that are used with that 4% rule. So, but you can see $40,000 a year to start is much less than $50,000. So you could be left with less up front, maybe for the first 5-10 years, but eventually over time you could be better off if this does not have a cost of living adjustment. And you could stress the portfolio and do a 5% withdrawal to get to that $50,000, but now you're going to risk maybe running out of money sooner than 30 years. And some again will argue that you could go even further than 30 years, right? If you get a 7% rate of return each year for the rest of your retirement, then you're good. You can take out 5%. You can also probably take out more. It's a consideration there. But as we know, we don't know what future market outlooks will look like. The only thing we have based on right now is, we can go off of an organization like Vanguard, who did a study that shows that equities may only do 3 to 5% over the next 10 years. And I've done another video on that. And so if that were the case, then maybe we are a little bit more concerned about that 4% rule and taking out that out of $1 million. And maybe in that situation, maybe that $50,000 a year guaranteed makes more sense. And so you can see all the different stipulations here. But the other thing to think about with this $1 million is you're running the risk of market risk, interest rate risk, and all the other risks that come with it. Not to say that pensions don't have those own risks in itself, but let's say that you have everything invested in equities, which is probably not something we'd recommend if you're planning on taking out income from this $1 million. If you're planning on taking out $40,000 or $50,000 a year, we probably want to be smarter about how we deal with that money. But if you have $1 million and the market goes down, 50% overnight, like 2008, well, now you're at $500,000, and now that 4% rolled in order to get 40,000. Now you're going to have to take out 8%, and now it's going to withdraw that account even more, and you're going to be left with less money at the end of time. And so you can see how it could be a little more risk there of how you invest it. But again, if you said, hey, I'm going to take all this, I want to put it in money markets right now, which are accruing about 4% per year, and then you could just live off that interest each year, could be something to consider too. You don't have to worry about the big risk, but as you're going to need more than 4% to keep up with inflation over time, you may not be left with as much there. So obviously you can see how that works, but if you're not worried about remaining that principal and you only get a 3 or 4% return each year, well, you may be eating some of that principal. But again, we've already done the math. $1 million, if you take out $50,000 per year and you have no interest, it will still last you 20 years. And so if you are getting interest on that, that will just allow you to have it for a further amount of time there. The other reason people really like taking the lump sum option, and again, this video is just a fun example of which one to take, million or 50. I'd rather take the $1 million if the 50,000 doesn't have a cost of living adjustment. I think that's pretty obvious. I think the majority of people would appreciate and agree with that. And another reason why people agree to take the lump sum is for the legacy benefits, right? If you pass away tomorrow, and let's say you want to leave your pension to your kids, well, most pensions won't allow you to leave that to your kids. Well, if you pass away tomorrow and you took the lump sum, well, they get $1 million that they get to do what they wish with and do what they want with. So there's more flexibility there, but also maybe you want to take a lump sum purchase and buy an RV or buy a boat or buy a second home, and well, now you've got that cash available to do so. You may have to face some tax consequences if it's in a tax deferred investment and worry about things like IRMA that we talk about a lot on this channel and other things that could pop up. But you do have more flexibility, whereas a pension, you can't go to the pension company and say, hey, can you pay me double this year and not pay me next year just so I can have some extra cash right now? There's not as much flexibility, obviously, with the pension. And something that we always think about with the lump sum versus the pension payout is you're going to have more flexibility for tax planning as well, especially things like Roth conversions. And this can also play a benefit in legacy planning and planning for your spouse if you were to pass away. But you could basically, take this $1 million and maybe you look to move half of it over to a Roth over a certain amount of years. Now you have a balance of some in Roth, some in traditional. So now when you do go to elect to take out money, you can choose, is it going to be tax-free or is it going to be taxable? So that's one thing we help a lot of our clients with that are in this position with pensions and over $1 million is, should we be doing strategic Roth conversions right now while tax rates are potentially lower than what they will be in the future, and look to fill up some of these lower tax brackets in order to have that flexibility in the future? And as you know, with a pension, you're kind of stuck with that $50,000 a year coming in. You can't really choose what tax rates are going to be at for that year that you're going to be taking that $50,000. Whereas over here in the million, maybe in a year where tax rates are higher, we can pull from the Roth. That allows us to keep more of our money, and then we can take from the traditional when tax rates, like right now, are among historically low. So that would be the consideration. But with a pension, you're always stuck. You're always stuck potentially paying more IRMA premiums. And again, all good problems to have if you have a pension. We're not here to talk bad about pensions today, but you can understand the value of each. And and I'll be pretty honest with you. This scenario I'm telling you is kind of unrealistic. Most pensions, if you are saying, hey, I want to take a lump sum option, and if it says it's $50,000 a year, typically they're not going to give you $1 million. Typically it'd be much less. And so that's something to just consider as well. This is just for illustrative purposes and not a real life case here. I just want to make that clear. And again, back to the legacy, if you can have the ability to move more towards Roth, well, then that's going to be better, typically for the beneficiaries. If you expect them to be in a same tax bracket or higher in the future, now that they have to take out these IRAs within 10 years, this gives them some flexibility to not have to pay all of that tax over 10 years. They can withdraw it over time, and they can have that be tax-free at potentially their highest income earning years, and potentially times when tax rates are higher are always considerations. But one thing we also always talk about on this channel is the widow's penalty, and that's where the lump sum could come into play. But also you got to consider, if you take that $50,000 pension, is there even going to be a survivorship option with that associated with that? So as we know, if you take the survivorship option and say, hey, I want my spouse to take my pension if I pass, that's going to typically cost you to do. So instead of getting $50,000, maybe you only get $45,000 or $40,000 a year in order to pay for that spouse to have that benefit moving forward. And it can be pretty pricey, and so that's something you always want to consider. Not to say we shouldn't do it. You always have to make sure the spouse is good to go, especially if they pass away tomorrow. But is there better ways to do it? Maybe through life insurance, or maybe you can get by with a 50% survivor, save some money. But the key is to make sure that spouse is good no matter what happens there. So that's just something to be aware of there. Now, if you take the lump sum, there becomes more issues in planning for that income for the spouse, but you do have more control where you can use married filing jointly tax rates while you're living, and so if one spouse were to pass, the single tax rates are going to be less advantageous for that spouse. But now if you're taking out from Roth, as we talked about, it may be more beneficial there. And also, if you are in poor health, then maybe that's a reason in itself just to take the 100% survivor option, because that's going to be more beneficial if you pass away early. But if you live till 80 and your spouse lives till 81, well, then you're only getting 1 year payout, but you paid for it for 20 years. And so that may not be as beneficial. So those are all things to just think about and consider as you are planning your retirement. And if you do have that option that you can choose, the survivorship option, and then the other one we really help clients with is what we're talking about here, is the lump sum option. And now, as I look to conclude this video, I do want to make it very clear that studies do show that having a predictable and guaranteed income over your retirement makes people happier. And so obviously most people watching this channel have a pension, and so you can relate. Only 20% of people have pensions. If you talk to your friends, when they hear you have a pension, they get very jealous, and they just tell you how great of a position you are in. And I'm here to tell you the same thing. You're in a great position. You're blessed to be able to have that opportunity, and you've worked extremely hard for it. And so that's something that is going to be important for your retirement. But the studies show if you can have that guaranteed income, you're going to be happier, and because you're not going to have to worry about where the money's coming. You can rely on that as time goes. If the market goes down, you're not as worried. And so those are all considerations to be made there. And another thing that we always talk about with pensions, people with pensions that have $1 million or more, is how do you want to look to invest that $1 million or more? And some of our clients, they're very conservative. Other clients are more aggressive. And so we always tell them, when you have a pension like that, and if it is going to cover a majority of your living expenses on, in addition to Social Security, you can take as much risk as you want to, or you can take as least risk as you want to. You can take the least amount of risk if you want to do that, because at the end of the day, risk and returns are correlated, right? The more risk you take, the more return you should get, but also it's going to be more volatile. Whereas if you take less risk, you may get less return. So the reason why we say it like this for clients is because if you take less risk, well, you're still going to be successful. We don't need 100% rates of return every year to be successful. You've already met your goals. You've already saved enough. We just need to be, consistent over time. So that can work. But also you can argue that taking on more risk, getting higher return could be worth it, right? I mean, maybe you want to leave the biggest legacy you can, or you want to grow this nest egg as much as you can. Well, if that's the case, you could live with it potentially going down because you have this pension to rely on. And so some people would consider that pension as part of their fixed income or their bond portfolio or their protected portfolio, depending on who you're talking to, of how they communicate that. So that's just something to give you some peace of mind there as well. So with that being said, that's all I've got on today's episode of Joe Knows Retirement. I mentioned that Midwestern Millionaire book earlier. If you've been watching this channel for a while, and I'd love to just give this out to whoever's watching here. So if you go to the description below, you can click on a link there, and you can put in your contact information, your address, and someone on our team will send you out that book. So it is a great book, and I'd love to hear your feedback. And go ahead and put in the comments here below of what you think of this channel. What more would you like to hear? What other questions can I address in these videos? So that's all I've got on today's episode of Joe Knows Retirement.